Hello again. I thought I'd talk this evening about a very old wives' tale which has been circulating for the Lord knows how many years. Certainly the Nazis used it as a propaganda method, and that's the idea that it was the British who first used concentration camps or who invented them. Valeriano Valeri Nicolau, born in 1838, was the son of a Prussian, which was part of what we now call Germany. His father was a career soldier who had moved to Spain, and Valeriano decided to follow in his footsteps, becoming a lieutenant in the Spanish army by the age of 20, although still retaining the same nationality as his father, which is to say Prussian. He was a German soldier. His was a glittering military career. He fought in the 10 Years' War, which took place between 1868 and 1878, and was later appointed Captain General of the Canary Islands. It was an earlier incident in his life, though, when as a young man he had been sent to Washington as a military attaché at the Spanish embassy, that gave Valeriano Vela the idea for which he was to attain fame, or perhaps more accurately, notoriety. During the American Civil War, while he was attached to the embassy in Washington, young Vela heard about the tactics employed by General William Sherman as he swept through the southern states, using what would become known later as a scorched earth policy. Not only was Sherman an exponent of brutal warfare, burning entire towns to terrify the enemy into submission, he also waged a campaign which some thought amounted to genocide against the Indians. Using his slogan, "The only good Indian is a dead one," Sherman harried the Indians mercilessly, seeing that they were penned up in camps where they died from starvation and illness. Sherman's activities, both against the Confederacy and the Indians, made a great and lasting impression upon the young soldier who went on to govern several Spanish colonies. At the age of 58, General, as he was by then Vela, was sent to Cuba to suppress by any means he chose the rebellion which was threatening to drive the Spanish from the island nation. When he arrived in Cuba as a newly appointed governor of the colony, Vela found that the rebels were practically at the gates of Havana, the capital. He realised that only an altogether new and radical policy would be able to save the country for Spain. The expression concentration camp might only date from the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, but the concept itself is an ancient one. In 1997, an archaeologist working at Hadrian's Wall even suggested that evidence had been found of the world's earliest concentration camp, which had been set up in Britain. The foundations of many round huts were found near a Roman fort, and the idea was mooted that this had been some sort of camp under the control of the Roman army and holding British hostages. More recently, camps such as Andersonville in Georgia, a prisoner of war camp during the American Civil War, have produced conditions as shocking as any seen in the 20th century. Of the 45,000 Union prisoners sent to Andersonville, no fewer than 13,000 died of starvation and disease. The commandant of the camp was hanged after the war. Most of the previous camps that were established before the Cuban War, places like Andersonville, were specifically for prisoners who had been fighting against an army or working to overthrow a regime. What was novel about the camps set up by General Vela was that they were from the very beginning intended to house civilian non-combatants, primarily women and children who had no part in any fighting. The main problem faced by the Spanish army in Cuba was that the guerrillas fighting them were all but indistinguishable from the ordinary Cuban peasants who were working the land. These men could ambush a Spanish column and then slip back into their homes later and resume their normal life, which meant that the enemy had no need to worry about supplies and so on. They just went home at the end of the action to wives who had a hot meal ready and waiting for them. It was clear that unusual action would be needed and unconventional tactics would have to be devised to combat this new type of belligerent. The idea that General Vela came up with was to clear the countryside of its inhabitants and force the entire population into special areas. These areas would then be fortified and defended against any rebels. Anybody found in countryside would be automatically viewed as an insurgent and liable to be shot down without warning. The fertile fields themselves would be untended and the peasants confined to the new camps left to provide for themselves as best they were able. On 21st of October 1896, General Weyler announced all the inhabitants of the country now outside the line of fortifications shall within the period of 8 days concentrate themselves in the towns so occupied by the troops. The homes that the peasants left behind were frequently destroyed and their farms ravaged so they could not provide food for the rebels. The temporary camps set up within the towns were only ever intended to be a stopgap measure. No real provision was made for those within them. As the months passed, conditions grew increasingly desperate. To get some idea of the conditions of these reconcentrados, as the Spanish called those whom they had concentrated in this way, we cannot do better than examine the evidence of an eyewitness. United States Senator Redfield Proctor from Vermont visited Cuba to see for himself what was happening in the country. On the 17th of March 1898, he gave a speech in the US Senate describing what he had found in his stay in the country. It is not peace, nor is it war. It is desolation and distress, misery and starvation. Every town and village is surrounded by a trench, a sort of rifle pit, but constructed on a plan new to me. These trenches have at each corner, at frequent intervals along the sides, what they are there called forts, but are really small blockhouses, many of them like a large sentry box, loopholed for musketry. The purpose of these trenches is to keep reconcentrados in, as well as to keep the insurgents out. From all the surrounding country, the people have been driven into these areas and held there to subsist as best they can. They are virtually prison yards, not unlike one in general appearance, except that the walls are not so high and strong, but they suffice, where every point is in range of a soldier's rifle, to keep the poor reconcentrado women and children. With no crops to harvest in the towns, no livestock, the situation for the hundreds of thousands of smallholders and peasants who were thus confined in that way was dire indeed. What Weyler called his reconstruction plan may well have been a military success, but it soon became a humanitarian disaster. Well over 250,000 people died of hunger or disease as a direct consequence of Weyler's actions in setting up his camps for reconcentrados. One figure for the total number of dead is 321,934. Scorched earth policies and the destruction of homes, herding civilians into captivity behind barbed wire fences might have been a novelty at the end of the 19th century, but it was to be anything but out of the ordinary by the time that the 20th century ended. Indeed, the concentration camp, as used by Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, Communist China and Britain, bids fair to be something of a leitmotif for the entire century. From the time of General Weyler onwards, civilians were frequently regarded as legitimate targets during times of war, rather than, as was previously the case, being seen as largely an irrelevance. Non-combatants were now viewed as pawns to be used and abused as circumstances dictated. This then is the origin of the concentration camp. It's got nothing at all to do with the British and everything to do with the German general.